All right, recording. All right, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Nate Hubbard. I worked with Ivan Shapirov and Michael Kellum to create Conway's Game of Life. So this is just these are the roles we had. Ivan did the game development. Michael worked on the database and login, as well as some of the web pages, and then I just worked on some of the web pages and did designing CSS. Quick description. Conway's Game of Life, 0-player game. So you start with a seed entered by the user, and the game runs infinitely on its own. Each cell represents a house, a person, a part of the population that can be either alive or dead. And each cell, upon the generation of a new generation, follows a few rules. A living cell with less than 2 neighbors or more than 3 neighbors dies. Dead cell with exactly 3 neighbors becomes alive again. And then any other cell stays the same as it was.
So this is the game page. Essentially, it's just an HTML file with a bunch of buttons and drop-down menus. And we use divs to be able to style it easier later. Next slide. So this is the begin function. This happens as soon as you enter the page, and you will get a pop-up which will ask you to enter the grid size, and this will be the size of the grid you see for the game. So this shows how the grid itself was created. It lets the user click on the grid and how the generation of population is displayed. So based on the user's input for the grid size, I created a table and I inserted a cell and gave each cell an event listener. And this event listener would essentially update the large grid. So I had a global 2D array, and wherever the user would click on the grid, I would update that array to have a 1 in that spot. And the show generation population, it simply gets those 2 tags from the HTML page, and it just updates it with the new values. This is how the game updates. So whenever the next generation happens, essentially I would just iterate through the entire grid and look at each neighbor individually and check all of the cases. Does it have less than 2 neighbors? Does it have more than 3 neighbors? I was just looking at those things, and then I would create a new grid and fill it in with those new values. And at the end, I would replace the old grid with these new values and update the entire table. So this is for the start and stop buttons and the pattern select. So the start and stop buttons, I would just use a set timeout function. So whenever the user would click start, every second it would update the grid with whatever input they had inserted before, and stop would just clear that timeout. The patterns, it was just a simple drop down. I would check which input the user selected, and whenever they would change the pattern, I would update the grid with that pattern. And I just manually inserted the new values into the grid.
All right, so I was in charge of the database integration. So this first file was the config.php, and it just takes in the server info and username and password and that database name. So with COD server, it's localhost because you're accessing it through PuTTY, and then username and password are the same for that's just how COD server is set up, and same with the database name. So once you set it up, you're good to go. And the registration just takes the config that PHP, so it has that connection. Basically, what it does is it takes each form. I think the next slide it has the HTML. So the HTML is designed so there's the username, the password, and confirm password. And when you submit, it basically just checks the code. So if you submit and there's an error, it says enter username, that'll pop up if it's empty and you submit it. And there's just all those kind of checks there. Like you could see username already taken, or the password needs to be longer than 4 characters, or they don't match. But essentially, once you submit it and everything looks good, it'll run a query that will add the values into the users table. And I'll show that table later when we demonstrate. Login is pretty simple as well. You just when you submit, I think here's HTML on this page. So yeah, when you press submit, it will take a look at what you put in the username and password forms, and it will do another query. And if the password matches with a hash value in the database, then you'll be logged in. And at the bottom, just in case you don't have an account, you can click to sign up, so you can register there. And I just have some basic CSS to make it look okay and presentable.
Right, so I was in charge of the overall design of the main web page, I guess. So the style is pretty minimal. Just use basic tags for some of the main elements. And then there's 4 main pages: the home, the actual game, some info about the game itself, and the credits for all the sources. So one of the main aspects included was a navigation bar on all the pages. That is basically just an unordered list, and the components are modified so that when you hover over them, it will change aesthetically, and then when a link is activated or the user is on a specific link, then that item in the list will be highlighted. Awesome. And then some of the buttons for the game. These also made use of the hover function for some of the classes. And they basically all just change to their corresponding colors. So there's red, green, blue, and black, all in total. Not much to those. We can go to the next slide. Awesome.
Okay.
That's you.
So this is pretty much just what the database has. So it just has a simple ID, user, and password. We could have added more stuff to it, like a score system, but it doesn't really work for Conway's game of life. But simply put, the ID is auto-incremented, so you don't have to put that. And then the username and password. The password is hashed to keep it secure. That way, if you like see the data, you can't just get the password.
The navigation bar was included in all the pages via just this little unordered list, and you can see when each one is activated, it'll just change its class to active to represent it on the page. All right, so in conclusion, we implemented a login registration using PHP. We did the game logic in JavaScript, the UI design and the web pages were done in HTML and CSS. And then we created a database that you can log into through or on the COD server through PuTTY. And we used a user table for data storage. I think that's about it.
Yep,
Anybody else has anything to say?
Yeah, I can go ahead and demonstrate. So let me go ahead and go over to it. So, also, if you try to connect to the index automatically and you're not logged in, it'll automatically take it to login. So here's what the users table looks like. I'm gonna go ahead and make a new account just for demonstration. So new account. And now if I check, oops, should we do that? Now if I check, new account's there. So I'll go ahead and type the info I put. And now we're logged in. So we have the home page, the info page, that lets you try to play, in the credits page as our resources, what kind of help we got to complete the game. And here's the actual game. So here's the prompt from JavaScript. We'll just put 15. And then you can select a pattern down here. So, here's beacon. You can also input stuff like that. And then when you press start, it'll run through. Oh, that was a pretty bad design, but nonetheless, it works. And you can also increment 1 generation. We can go 23 generations. And that works perfectly. And the reset button works. And that's about it. Thank you. All right.